What would you say are some of the biggest challenges working on a brand as big as Verizon?
We go on Instagram right now and we pull up the comments, it's like, F you, Verizon.
I'm curious if there's pressure on the social team to have any form of direct conversion metrics.
An Adweek panel we did recently where someone from the crowd was like, what about conversions? And all the social media marketers were like, no.
As of today, what are some social media trends or tactics that you feel is really working for brands?
Make time for yourself and your team to read about what's going on, read about new features, read about what brands are doing, what brands are doing that haven't worked or things that have worked. If they're getting it here on social and they're getting my attention, their product must be a reflection of that.
Today on Deep Feed, I chat with Gabriel Gomez, the social strategy and brand engagement lead at Verizon. He is ranked a top social media voice on LinkedIn, where he shares on-point marketing tips and inspiration. In this episode, we discuss his experience making the leap from a major agency to a big brand and some of the biggest social media challenges for a Fortune 100 company like Verizon. We also cover how to create a unified social media strategy when you're running multiple campaigns and sponsorships, how to measure success, what's working on social media right now, and much more. Let's get into it. Hi, Gabe. Welcome to Deep Feed.
Hi, Winner. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, so you are the social strategy and brand engagement lead at Verizon. What does that entail exactly?
Yeah, strategy is such a funny word because a lot of folks tend to use it, whether you're working on social or e-commerce or just any marketing. We're like, what's our strategy? I think it's a great question to start on. How I like to think about the role of a strategist or a strategy on a team is if the creative team is creating the what, strategy is kind of informing the why and a little bit of the how. So with any social post, really our main job as a strategy team is to inform, why are we posting this? Who are we creating this content for? It's kind of like the back of house, I think, of a lot of the content that you see on social. And it helps just contextualize my own role sometimes because you can get lost in the sauce when you're working in social, right? It's kind of like whose role is what when you have a large team. And that's a great way to just ground myself and others I'm working with when it comes to what's our role for this project or for this content.
Yeah, so in terms of some of the specific tasks that you're doing, what does a typical
Yeah.
day in the life look
Day
like?
in the life. That's a good question because I think whether it's Verizon or outside of Verizon, I've been working in the social media field for 6 years now, and no day is the same. I'm sure y'all can relate a little bit as well, but at Verizon, it could be just a day of content creation, for example. But then the next day could be all about reporting and talking to our agency partners and thinking about the content for July. And when I was agency side, it looked different every day as well. It can be if, we're doing crisis management one day, if we are just a day of planning for next year. I think, some folks think social media might just be scrolling through the comments or scrolling through TikTok and seeing what's out there, but it actually has so much dimension to it.
Yeah.
And you're working cross-functionally with PR, you're working with possibly sales folks. So I think it could look different. It does look different, and it could look even more different depending on what brand you're working on and what teams are kind of in your peripheral vision too.
Yeah, so at Verizon, what is the structure of the marketing team exactly?
Yeah. I'm 7 months in at the moment, and it's a huge organization, and I think I'm still learning about how it's structured. But our immediate team, kind of the social team and the folks kind of, creating the content you see when you go on the Verizon handles on Instagram or TikTok or X. Our team is comprised of essentially a group of strategists like myself. We have project managers as well. We also have copywriters and art directors, and our amazing head of social who kind of leads the charge for kind of all things consumer social marketing and influencer as well. And I'm really grateful for that because it's really a team of specialized folks versus kind of, having one catch-all social media manager, rock star, ninja to kind
Right.
of do everything. So I feel really lucky to be on a dynamic team that can kind of cover our bases in a lot of ways. But teams look really different depending on where you are too. I've definitely met those who are just the social media manager for a brand, and they handle like the reporting, the analytics, but also the content creation and the project management. And it's so tough, and hats off to those folks. But our team is super dynamic, which is awesome.
That must be an amazing experience to work somewhere where there is a lot of actual support. Because I
Yeah.
think for so many brands, yeah, there's like 3 people doing everything, and it's
Yeah.
really hard. So that, must be a whole different kind of experience, which
Yeah.
a lot of people are very, like, jealous of, I think. But there's
Yeah.
pros and cons, though. Having
Absolutely.
small teams too creates different creative challenges, which can be
Yep.
beneficial in some ways
Totally.
too. So at Verizon, are there a lot of, in terms of for social media content specifically,
Mhm.
like agency partners or freelancers you hire in house? Like you mentioned having a content creation day. Like where's that
Yeah.
content coming from?
Yeah, it comes from like a different kind of like inputs and outputs. Like many like larger brands, it's like super matrixed. And for our team and other teams I've seen as well, it's like you might have a combination of like where content's coming from, where you're briefing an agency and they have a certain scope or a certain remit, and they're really focused on creating content for one channel or creating content for a campaign or like one kind of like content bucket. And that's sort of how we're structured at the moment, where we have a few agency partners who really support us in, XYZ ways, whether it's content output or community management or reporting. But then our team also does a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to, what's the brief for this content, who on our creative team can create it. We were actually just in California last week creating content during music festival. Verizon's huge on like kind of giving access to customers with like experiences. So we were on the ground making content versus our agency partners making content, for example, which is pretty fun. But that's a little bit of the world we live in, where it can just be different sources depending on who's maybe most qualified for the role or job, for example, or who's just like available and around.
So you've only been at Verizon for about 7 months. Is that correct?
Yep.
Yeah. And you came from the big PR agency, Edelman. So how has that shift been for you going from a large agency to the brand side?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. And, it's funny. I think about that still, where I'm newer to the brand side, but um, I was 6 years agency side, and Edelman, I was definitely my highest tenure. I was 4 years there working on a ton of awesome brands, and that experience was incredible. The folks there are so smart and really collaborative, and the clients were incredible. And it's interesting. I think agency side for me personally, it was a lot easier to focus on the work we're doing, because I think that's what your role as an agency is a little bit. It's like, how can we best counsel our clients and their brand and their unique kind of brand or business challenges, and how can we really focus on the work to make the best work possible?
Mhm.
And so being brand side and kind of being the person who's maybe briefing your agency partners or reviewing the work that comes in, it's kind of just like a different mindset, because you're, instead of kind of thinking, how to push the work and the work's quality, and you might still be thinking that for sure, but it's I find myself thinking about more kind of like the positioning, like, is this the right message we're giving out right now? Is this how we want to position the brand? Which I hate saying out loud, because I would sometimes roll my eyes at an agency side. I was like, "Oh, what do you mean? Like, this is content is great. It doesn't matter. Like, just like test it anyway." But I definitely, being on the other side of it is interesting how important it is, and how much effort goes into making sure we're saying the right things at the right time, and making sure that also the folks internally on the brand side are also kind of on board with it. There's like a lot more socialization of the work as
Mhm.
well, versus on the agency side, I felt like it was much more like a sprint to get the work done, making sure it looked great and felt great. So that's been one of the things that just kind of come to mind 6 months in.
Yeah, how was your role, at Edelman? Like, were you doing social strategy there as well?
Yeah, it was interesting. I was had a few different roles at Edelman, and it was like a bit of an account management role, but also a hybrid like digital strategy role, which I really loved, because it gave me the opportunity to like talk to clients face to face and be like, let's be real. Is
Mhm.
this the direction you want to go? Or, where do we need to take it with the team? And also be able to counsel them on like what's the right thing we should do during a crisis, or hey, here's how we should position our social strategy for the year, knowing that these platform updates are coming along, for example. So it was a hybrid role, which I really loved, because I like the kind of dynamic environment that comes with marketing. So it was perfect to kind of do a little bit of everything.
Yeah. How have you seen social change from your time at the agency to today, basically?
I mean, wow, I it's changed. I mean, social you all know like social changes like week to week. We're like, wait, what update is this? Or is Threads like still around? Like
Yeah.
no shade to Threads. But I think it's changed. I think incrementally for sure. I don't think there's been like a kind of day to night change in social necessarily, but I think it's interesting to see how much brands or how many brands rather are adapting kind of like a more human tone
Mhm.
to their content. And it's really interesting because one thing we talk about really often internally and with our partners actually is sort of like, if you look up Chipotle, for example, or insert like brand here and you look at their page and then you take a step back and you just kind of search the brand on TikTok and you see the content that's created from their community, a lot of the times like actually looks really similar.
Mhm.
And I find that fascinating where brands are kind of a mirror of their community and the brands that are getting social right or the brands that are breaking through, what you see like views in the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, like you see them mirroring their community in a lot of ways. And I think that's actually been a change that I've seen gradually over time. Whereas a few years ago, you'd see brands maybe be more careful about what they say, how they say it. But now I think brands are willing to take more calculated risks, so to speak. And those risks are how can we talk more human?
Yeah.
And is that the right direction for us? So I think that's actually been a really exciting shift I've personally seen.
So what does it look like when a brand mirrors their community?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it depends on what kind of brand you are, but let's stay on the food, the Chipotle train. So let's say Chipotle notices, oh my gosh, like a lot of our communities talking about like extra guac or this like one menu item that they like hacked recently. That's like a signal for the brand to be like, oh, we should talk about this. If it's kind of like an engine that's already going, a conversation that's already happening, that's such a great way to like A, show you're listening and B, kind of play off of that existing conversation versus kind of creating your own, like in a vacuum, right? It's like, oh, well, let's plan the content for July. Okay, well, what are we going to say? We have this menu hack we can talk about because it's already being kind of spoken about by our community. So that's been something that's happening more often, and it's working for a lot of brands, which is really great.
Yeah, I think I love seeing that when brands are obviously listening to what's going on, but also it's so funny in the case of Chipotle, the
Yeah,
whole like they're limiting portions when
yeah,
when it's takeout and they
yeah,
also like came on and fully addressed that as well.
totally.
I like to see brands addressing like rumors whether they're true or not.
Yeah,
But
it's
yeah.
it's definitely an interesting it can be a double-edged sword in that regard where, you're like, "Is this is something we should talk about? Is it the right time? Is it the right message?" But ultimately, I think that's what social's for. There was a brilliant creative that we were working with that was like, we should be social on social." And now
Yeah.
I'm just, like, thinking about that when I, like, just log on for the day, I'm like, "Let's be social on social."
Yeah.
And it's been such a great kind of just, North Star, so to speak, to just think about.
Yeah, and I think, actually, I think it was Glossier. Everyone was kind of bitching that the bomb.com got like the formula changed, and Glossier was able to take a lot of negative feedback and
Yeah,
turn it into they made this like whole video campaign about it where they acknowledged it and brought the formula back, and they turned it into this like joke moment, but they did it really in a very smart way, and I think that I completely agree with you. I
yeah,
love when brands are, like, really in it and are kind of, like, going back and forth with their communities in real time. Like, that's the best social
absolutely.
strategy for sure.
Yeah, and it just takes the courage. I know it's like can be really scary, and I'm sure you've experienced this too, working with your clients or in your past work as well, where you're kind of like, what's like a way you can do it that feels inspiring, that feels creative. And I think that's a perfect example of like how to actually do that, turn a conversation, flip it into its head, and make it like a positive brand moment.
Yeah. So for a company as big as Verizon, with when we look at the Instagram, for example, there's obviously so many different sponsorships and, campaigns going on. How do you create a unified social strategy in that environment?
Yeah. And that's a great question, and I think that that's a challenge, whether it's Verizon or other brands that have like a lot going on. I think it's something you have to kind of keep the pulse on because a lot of the times, you can set a strategy, but are your teams following it? Like, are you following the strategy that you set, basically? And I think one way we try to do that is to make sure that we give ourselves a bit of the wiggle room, obviously. Like, it's like, hey, if we have all these sponsorships going on, how can we make it feel cohesive? Right. So if
Yeah.
like our strategy for a sponsorships moment is all around the access we give, let's make all that content around that access point. So you can have like a ton of, or yeah, a myriad of different like sponsorship pieces of content. But if they all kind of tell a story that feels cohesive, that's a way to kind of like turn the chaos or what feels like chaos into something that serves like a larger brand building purpose, for example. So I think that could be a good way to like ground any strategy in that, right? It's like we have 6 different content outputs. Okay, let's make sure 3 out of those 6 ladder up to this objective, while the other 3 ladder up to the other. So you
Yeah.
can kind of just ground yourself because it can be really easy to get lost in the sauce, so to speak, on social.
Yeah, what would be an example of an objective that you're using to guide these
Yeah.
sponsorships?
So if you have like, well, I mean, a social goal, right? It's like we have all the sponsorship content. What's the takeaway? Like, what do you want your audience to feel when they see this content? It's like for us, it's all about access, but for another brand, it can be all about value. X brand has like I get the best bang for my buck at this retail location, for example. And sometimes I worked on brands where it's all about entertainment and like brand love. So the
Mhm.
reaction we want to elicit is like a share or a like or a comment. And that can also just dictate what you post, how you post it, etc. So I think those are just, yeah, some examples of the goal that you can have in mind.
When you say access, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, access. So Verizon gives customers the access to, let's say, like festivals where we have a Verizon viewing deck. At GovBall, for example, that just happened here in New York. This past weekend, we had a viewing deck there, and Verizon customers could access it and get really awesome views of the show, for example, where they're not like shoulder to shoulder with everyone, but they kind of have like a space to sit, a space to like see the stage without kind of having to be too close or too far. And those are kind of like the access points or one example of an access point that customers could get from being a Verizon customer.
That's really cool. How would you describe Verizon's high-level approach to social media?
Yeah, I think we're building that at the moment. And I think I've started at a great time where we are really kind of just questioning everything about how we do, why we do it. And I think it's great that like large a large legacy brand is doing that, and also, like, any brand does that, where now especially where social can change in a flip of a dime, it's great to ask yourself those questions, but, at Verizon, we are essentially building a strategy where we can be of service to the customers on social. So we think, like, is our content serving a utility purpose or, like, an entertainment purpose? And that's where we're kind of grounding everything at the moment. So it's like if our content's all around utility, let's talk about the benefits, the perks, whatever that is. If a content's all about entertainment, let's make it flashy or let's make it like around a trend that's going on.
Mhm.
And those are kind of like, our 2 filters for how we're creating something at the moment. And it works really well because there's so much that Verizon's doing. It's great to kind of like simplify something into like those 2 buckets, for example.
Yeah, what do you think is working really well right now at Verizon?
I think, we're in the middle of, like, kind of painting that picture. We're trying a lot right now, which is really exciting, but what's worked for us in the past was actually what we were just talking about, just, like, that humanizing content, and, I was talking about this in with a few folks, but, on my 4th day there y'all might recall the, Nicki Minaj album that was coming out, and everyone was, like, raving around, like, Gag City and, like, folks started or that community started to create content, like AI generated memes essentially around like different like brands like entering Gag City, like while the album was like about to come out. And funny enough, a Verizon customer created like a Verizon Gag City image. And on my 4th day, I was like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. We have to like do something with this. And I felt lucky enough that my team was like, yes, let's try it. And it was a tweet that we put out in like 30 minutes that got a ton of engagement, just blew everything out of the water. And it was like free to do.
Yeah.
And we did it in under a day. And it just did so great that that is the kind of content that's been working for us, the kind of more like reactive, focus on like a cultural moment, for example, and just like human, like a
Yeah.
real thing that, not just a brand could say, but like your best friend could send you, right?
Yeah. How much content, like if there was a ratio, is planned super far in advance versus what you all as the social team there are allowed to like iterate on very quickly?
That's a great question. It's looked different. Personally, it's looked different from brand to brand that I work on. Some brands in the past that I worked on definitely skew heavier on like that reactive agile content versus a planned. Currently the split is actually a bit of 50-50, where we know certain moments we have to activate against, but we keep like something in the bank for, stuff that just like comes up because if you're on social, like it just happens like overnight.
Yeah.
And you're going to want to give yourself kind of like that space to be able to react, to be able to create in real time. So it's about a 50-50 split at the moment.
That's awesome because I think, speaking to colleagues who work at major brands, like they have said it can be a slow, like reacting to trends or something timely can sometimes you can have like a ceiling against what is approved quickly. So that's really cool that you're able to have that opportunity to like
Totally.
just quickly iterate on
Yeah.
something that is a current event. Um, Speaking of talent sponsorships and like how many campaigns and sponsorships are going on at Verizon. Um, what is that approach? Like, how does Verizon decide who they want to sponsor for the year or like for the years to come? What is that framework?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, as a newbie there, I've seen that it's been legacy relationship. So, if we have a long-standing relationship with like X entertainment platform, for example, that's definitely something that continues to just build over time. And then of course, and I think that covers like kind of like a sponsorships, partnerships, kind of side of things. And right now at the moment, of course, we're also thinking a lot about influencers and like those kind of partnerships and like how we can leverage influencers from not just like a content perspective, but like, can an influencer come to this event? Can it be more experiential? How else can we leverage like this partnership or collaboration with an influencer? So that feels much more exploratory.
Yeah.
And, I'm not on the sponsorships team, but from what I've seen, it's certainly kind of like how can we continue to build on these existing relationships?
That makes sense. Legacy.
Mhm.
So definitely if you were giving advice to, let's say, an influencer who wanted a Verizon
Yeah.
sponsorship, how would they like get in the running to kind of develop that relationship?
That's a great question. I think I've seen like it work. I've seen success in different ways when it comes from like a, hey brand, like let's work together. I think being agency side, I can say from experience that when we're looking for creators, we're definitely looking for creators who are already maybe posting the type of content that would make a natural like brand fit, right? So if you're like a retailer, is someone already like going into the stores? Doesn't have to be the store or brand you're representing or working for, but is there just that happening on that person's page?
Yeah.
It's an interesting challenge with like telecoms where it's like, well, do we consider folks who are just like using their phone, for example, right? But what's interesting about Verizon and like the opportunity that we have with the brand is that there are so many passion points that come with Verizon and like telecoms where it's like, gaming is in the mix with like something like a Verizon or music or sports because our sponsorships like actually reach all those passion areas. So when we're thinking about influencers, it's like, is there an influencer who's in the gaming space who's doing something really interesting and really innovative, or in the music space or in the sports space, for example? So if you're an influencer out there wanting to work with Verizon, I'd say, we are working or looking to work with people who are passionate about whatever they're doing, music, sports, gaming, for example. Even if it's like comedy, we're looking a lot into that as well. So I'd say follow your passion. I think brands like tend to pick up on that and say like, oh my gosh, this creator's like doing something that we're already kind of tied to. I want to do more of. Let's like consider working with them.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. That's really good advice for influencers to just show their true like passion.
Yeah,
Yeah. Speaking of the ultimate influencer, the Beyoncé Super Bowl ad
yeah.
called "Can't Be Broken." What was it like working on that campaign, and how did that concept come together?
Wow, I mean, both great questions. So, funny enough, I was 2 months into the gig at the time that campaign was kind of coming together. I can't speak too much to how the creative kind of all came together. I know Ogilvy, our amazing agency partners, were the folks who were kind of leading the charge in a lot of like the integrated work and the work with B and that amazing spot. But from a social perspective and what the team I was on was able to work on, it was very much like meeting with our agency partner, meeting with the Ogilvy, meeting with our other agency partners to determine, okay, we have this concept. What's our plan like on the ground from like a community management perspective and a content perspective? Like, what are we going to tweet when the moment happens?
Hmm.
What are we going to say to our fans when and if they react? So it was like a bit of like a let's scenario plan everything. And it's one of those moments where you could like definitely overthink it all and like go into a panic and be like, and freak out about it. But I think the thinking definitely paid off because we felt really prepared at the moment when, the spot aired, and we were kind of like ready for anything at that point, no matter what the kind of reaction was. And obviously it was, overwhelmingly positive, and folks were so excited to kind of see her and see that moment and hear about the music drop that happened
Yeah.
literally minutes after. So it was an awesome experience, but also, you know, um, after the adrenaline or in the middle of the adrenaline, you're also like, oh my gosh, I have so much anxiety because like what's gonna happen? But it was like such a great experience, and to be the team on the ground and like in the war room to
The war room.
yeah, if you know, to like do the thing and be there and be ready for anything was great.
Yeah, when the campaign dropped, I'm just curious, like, literally the details of, like, what dropped on social? Like, what did that look like on
Yeah,
Instagram? What did that look like on TikTok?
we honestly kept it super simple because it's Beyonce.
Yeah.
And that's it. But we, essentially put out I think it was like one or two tweets like that day, the day of the Super Bowl, and I think following the spot dropping. And Instagram and TikTok were really similar too. It was very kind of like a lighter touch, but that's a good example of not over engineering something and it working really well because the tweets, I think it was like maybe it was a total of like 5 posts across all our platforms, did so well. And I think
Mhm.
focusing the message worked really well for us at the time, because of the talent, because of the message, right? It was like more mass awareness in that case. So what we had to say was Beyonce.
Yeah.
So we kept it super simple and it worked really well.
Yeah, are there any other projects, and I know it's been, not even a year yet, but that anything that has really stood out to you as being something that is working really well for Verizon?
Yeah. I think we touched on it a little, but Verizon as a legacy brand, I think, has the opportunity, and many legacy brands, I think do as well, to just not get stuck in their own routine. So I think what's been working really well for us is just like continuing to kind of explore, ask ourselves a question like, we did this last year, but should we do this again this year? And in that same way, how can we improve? How can we optimize? It's like easy to kind of like sink in and get stuck into a routine for any brand on social. It's like, oh, this works. Like, let's keep doing it. And I think, we obviously doing that, a little bit of that where it's like, oh, this worked. We should continue to do it, but also making sure we pause and say, well, what else can we do? Or how can we innovate? Because I think that's so important for a legacy brand. You want to kind of stay top of mind. And, Verizon's like a household name, which is great, but how can we be a name that, folks like, kind of have like a positive relationship with? And that's like something social can help with. Like, oh man, like Verizon posted this really funny and relatable thing. Like, I'm going to send it to my friends. Like, they're my phone carrier. Like, that's awesome.
Yeah.
So I think that's a bit of the excitement at the moment, like kind of like challenging ourselves to push the brand instead of kind of like being stuck in like, oh, this worked and we're good with that.
Yeah. What would you say are some of the biggest challenges working on a brand as big as Verizon?
That's a great question. I've worked on a few clients at that scale, in the past when I was agency side, but I think Verizon specifically is a huge telecom brand. And, if we go on Instagram right now and we pull up the comments, it's like, F you Verizon.
Yeah.
And people just like have that relationship with their phone carrier where it's like, it's one of those things where if it works, you don't say anything about it. But the second it stops working, you want to complain,
Yeah.
which like I do. And I'm sure a lot of folks have that experience. So that's certainly a challenge, like the sentiment. And how do we close the gap there, and feel more like human? So maybe folks can like also consider that as well before they're maybe dropping a comment like, oh, if the service isn't working, what are the, instead of like dropping a hate comment, like how can I, let me go reach out like to a customer service representative or something, right? Like
Yeah.
developing a more emotional connection, whether you're a telecom brand or retail brand or a food brand, I think always helps because it humanizes the brand. So I think it just like fostering that relationship always helps mitigate kind of like, that sentiment.
Yeah. How does Verizon kind of foster that humanization, do you
Yeah.
think?
We're trying a lot of different ways. I think that's the beauty of social, where like you can kind of keep trying different ways. And what we've seen working for us here and there is kind of just like what we were talking about, like humanizing the content,
Mhm.
humanizing how we talk, not only in the content, but like also how do we sound when we're like doing community management? How do we sound when we're creating like a longer form video, for example? So I think it's like creating that emotional connection in all the different touch points on social, even like a DM. We sometimes like spend like a few minutes talking about like, does this DM like sound like it's coming from like a person or like a robot?
Mhm.
And that's been so important. And that honestly like fosters like more human connection, where instead of like a copy and paste response in a DM, it's like personalized response that feels like it's coming from a friend or someone you know. It elicits like the responses that elicits is so different in the best way possible. So we're definitely kind of leaning into that.
Yeah. Um, I'm really curious just, like, how it works in terms of where Verizon decides to spend its marketing dollars. Like, is there a large meeting annually where you have, like, a specific theme or a North Star? How does that work?
Yeah, I honestly don't know much around the visibility of how like marketing dollars get distributed. And And yeah, I mean, I imagine it depends on a bit of the impact that teams have and all of that, along with like just the environment that the world is in. But don't have as much of the details there. But if
Yeah.
you want to know all the DMs we get, I can definitely talk about that.
Yeah, I wanna know.
Yeah.
Yeah, what are the DMs?
Yeah, well, luckily it's been better now. We actually just started an S&D program, Surprise and Delight, for those who might not be as familiar. And actually, after starting that Surprise and Delight program, we've been seeing just like or an increase rather of just like more positive messages that we're getting from folks who we're interacting with, which has been awesome. Again, that goes back to kind of like humanizing the brand. So it's interesting how like a tactic or an additive kind of tactic in your social plan can like increase in influx of like something like a DM, for example. It's not really a metric that marketers talk about, but it's so interesting to be like, oh, the health of our brand is not only what people are saying in public, but in private, which
Yeah.
is just really interesting.
Yeah. Can you explain a little more what that program is exactly?
Yeah, absolutely. We So surprise and delight, I think across the board is like, how can we surprise someone with like a package or a product, for example. So I've done this for a lot of different brands, and a lot of different brands do run surprise and delight kind of programs. But essentially, it's for Verizon, it's like, oh well, access, for example, we're one hero that. So is there a concert we can send people to? And the way that process works is essentially like we're doing social listening, and it's like, oh, this person in New York is saying they can't attend Gov Ball and they're a Verizon customer. Oh, we can actually hook them up with that and just like surprise them out of the blue. So we'll like drop a comment. We've identified the user, vetted this person, and said, hey, like, we can get you tickets, like, DM us. And then we like send them to their content, and they create content like, oh my gosh, like, this is really cool. I didn't know Verizon had this sort of access. I'm at the Verizon viewing deck. This is awesome. This is a perk I didn't know I had as a Verizon customer. And
Yeah.
so it's like really tactical, and it's like hard to scale at times, right? Because it's like really manual work. But that kind of program has really helped kind of jumpstart like more positive brand dialogue, which has been really awesome.
Yeah, no, I love that. How do you ensure that the social media strategy for Verizon is aligned with like the entire like company-wide brand objectives?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's an ongoing dialogue for sure, because I think that can change depending on the company you work at, like kind of like quarter to quarter or month to month. For example, I've worked with brands who they're like, our priorities have changed from last quarter, so we have to shift our strategy a little bit. Verizon, for example, they've really are leaning into access And so we've accounted for that in our strategy, where it's sort of like, okay, do we have content leaning to access? Do we have a surprise live program that leans into access? And how can we talk about it in community management where it's like fun, but not like kind of, feeling like an ad in the comment section, for example,
Yeah.
right? So we've made sure we've accounted for something like an access, not just in our content, but in our just like messaging strategy. And that's sort of how we take those inputs. It's like our business partners will inform us like this is like something huge we want to focus on this year, and we'll like kind of adapt that to our social strategy in a way that feels best for organic social, right?
Mhm.
Because you don't want to find yourself posting like an ad on your Instagram. You
Yeah.
want to like adapt that to the platform, whether it's a TikTok or an Instagram.
I'm curious if there's pressure on the social team to have any form of, like, direct conversion metrics. In terms of
Yeah.
like, is it just brand awareness, or are you
Yeah, yeah.
expected to drive actual signups?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I actually got that question at, an Adweek panel we did recently where someone from the crowd was like, "What about conversions?" And all the social media marketers were like, "No." We, are really we're measuring success by, like, a brand love kind of metric or metrics. So it's sort of like, how are we driving positive sentiment? How are we driving engagement for a campaign? We of course like track if we are linking somewhere, we'll track those kind of like link clicks, for example, but it's certainly not a priority KPI for us at the moment, which is really, really awesome. Because organic social is really made for that like human connection, that like brand love, that more like kind of higher funnel awareness.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what we're using to measure at the moment.
Yeah, so what does that look like in terms of measuring if a specific post was successful?
Yeah, that's a great question because there's a lot of dialogue on LinkedIn. I think specifically that I've seen around like how should we measure content? Is like engagement rate the end all be all of like content performance and success? And I think for us, we've definitely have been having ongoing conversations with our data and analytics team on like setting a measurement framework that doesn't kind of uh, you know make us fit in like just one box. So for example, if it's like we want content that's all about driving entertainment be measured by shares versus content that's all around, an experience someone had at the store measured by sentiment.
Mhm.
Those are the KPIs, right? So instead of like measuring like apples to oranges, like, oh, well, this one post had really high engagement rate, but really bad sentiment, for example. Well, what was it manufactured for? Like, what was the intent of that post, right? So I don't think I think it's best to kind of measure content in different ways depending on what the intended purpose was, versus kind of like having just like one engagement rate thing or one whatever the metric is or KPI is, like measure it across the board because
Yeah.
that's essentially that's just telling one side of the story versus like a fuller kind of like reporting story and reporting framework.
Yeah. Um, to quote you, you said, "One thing I always avoid when making presentations to executives, marketing soup."
Yeah.
What does marketing soup mean?
I did say that. Unfortunately. No, it's really funny because I've had a lot of amazing leaders that I feel really lucky about in my career. And one thing I kept hearing from them that wasn't marketing soup, but was like marketing soup adjacent was kind of like, how can we word diet this? How can we make this feel more simple? How can we make this feel more clear? And that's kind of where I landed at marketing soup, where like marketing soup is like, we our goal is to increase engagement rate by this content. Um, versus saying our strategy is to focus on X amount of X content type because we know it's gonna do great for us.
Mhm.
And it's just essentially it's just simplifying all the marketing mumbo jumbo on a slide because it makes it easier for marketing leaders to understand like, oh, I know my social team strategy. It's this one sentence. And it also makes it easier for like teams that don't work in marketing to also understand because if you're putting a presentation in front of your, um, DI leads or e-commerce leads, and it's like all this marketing soup mumbo jumbo, they're like, wait, what are you guys doing?
Yeah.
So it really just like helps everyone and helps your own team too, like reiterate the strategy. Because then if you're like talking to your creative teams and you're like, does this piece of content drive brand love through premium filters and whatever? They're gonna be like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
So yeah, we've just I found that to be such a great kind of like um way to kind of lower the barrier to entry, so to speak, in marketing presentations because you're just talking as plainly as you can.
Yeah, and I loved that when I saw that post about marketing soup because I've seen, in my day, even working with brands who have internal marketing teams, like a lot of marketing soup. And as the agency who's in charge of actually implementing, it's like, what does that mean? And
Yeah.
like, so when you
Yeah.
are a team member who needs to implement, it's really important that it's real language and it's actionable and there's examples and like otherwise, you don't know if everyone's on the same page. If it's
Right.
just like abstract, haughty language, it is actually completely meaningless. So,
Yeah.
so yeah, I really resonated with that. It's really good advice. Um, as of today, what are some like social media trends or tactics that you feel is really working for brands and that you feel like more brands should leverage?
It's a good question. I think aside from like the humanizing stuff, I think it's obviously keeping a pulse on what's actually happening. I think it can be really easy to go like a few months like not reading like the latest updates, the latest like hip and happenings, if you will, on like the social media marketing space. And as someone that can happen to myself where I'm like, "Oh, man, like, I haven't read, like, industry news in a while," you, like, kinda, like, start to fall behind. So, instead of, like, one thing or 2 things, like, brands should always do or a team should always do as, like, a hack or whatever, I think it's, like, just important to, like, make time for yourself and your team to, like, read about what's going on, read about like new features, read about like what brands are doing, what brands are doing that haven't worked or things that have worked. And just like use that as a knowledge sharing time for your team or just like to internalize that because that's honestly like the best way you can continue to make great content is to like constantly kind of feel inspired.
Yeah.
It's like an artist, not that I'm saying social media marketers are artists, but like we need inspiration just like any other kind of like creative team, right? Where
Yeah.
it's like what are we gonna say? Like, how are we gonna mix things up? And I think the best things come from just like seeing what's out there and also just like experimenting.
Yeah.
So I'd say those are just like that's like honestly like a true kind of hack for myself and the folks I've worked with.
Yeah, that's really funny you say that because actually, we at Posture we launched Creative Commerce, which is a newsletter that is literally a kind of a weekly roundup of
Mhm.
what's going on in the industry, but it's not just kind of a typical new features. It's also content to be inspired by and like things that are happening. Because I'm the author of the newsletter and I literally launched it to push myself also to have to read like a million other newsletters and a million other news sites to really curate and it helps and like pushes me to stay on top of trends too. So I think yeah, forcing yourself to really like take even if it's 30 minutes and subscribe to there's so many great newsletters out there. I'm a newsletter queen. I love
Yeah.
newsletters, but and really like take the time to absorb that information. I find myself all the time being like, "Well, like that is applicable to a client of
Right.
ours," or like I can like see that and it's like it's really it's a really really important good exercise so
Yeah.
you don't just get like complacent and bored with what you're doing.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, if you dedicate your 5 minutes to your Billie Eilish news,
Yeah.
and then you can dedicate the next
It's a
15
lot
to
of Billie
your
Eilish
yeah.
news and then a lot of social media news for sure.
Exactly. Yeah, just, like, sparse out the time. But no, I think you're right, and personally for me, it helps, like, I like to set focus time on my calendar where I'm like, "Okay, for these, like, 10 minutes, maybe it's, like, after lunch or before I start the day, I'm gonna, like, read my favorite newsletters." And, like,
Yeah.
it's such a great kind of if you can build that into a habit, that's great because then you can just like keep yourself inspired and also like share it with your team. And if you build that culture actually internally, if you're like, hey, on Wednesdays we share our favorite TikToks of the week, that's also a great way to if you're like not into reading newsletters, like just make that a thing that your team shares.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I'm curious like what works as a social team at a big company like to foster that innovation and inspiration. Like is there anything going on internally that you're like this is really helping you like feel aligned with your
Yeah.
colleagues and like kind of charged to continue to innovate?
Yeah, I we've done like, across different agencies and companies as that we have as clients or even, internally at Verizon, For example, we have like a internal kind of like social news chat where it's like 20 of us or something, and we're just like sharing like, oh my gosh, did you see this? Or this new brand collab just dropped, like, oh my gosh, this commercial, whatever. So like those group chats have been a great kind of way to like make it in your own time where like, oh, I have the time to catch up in this chat, or I have a second to send this thing, versus feeling the pressure to like, oh, I didn't have like 10 minutes today. My day was so crazy,
Yeah.
So that's something that's worked really well. And we've done that for a lot of other teams at agencies as well, where we're like have made like social school chats where it's like, if you don't know social, you can come to this social school chat and like learn about it or ask questions or share an article you thought was cool. Without feeling like, oh, is it weird if I share this? Like, is it obvious? Kind of like
Yeah.
removing that kind of like any judgment that comes from like, oh my gosh, like, did you guys know this? I find that's really helpful too.
Yeah, no, I love that. What are some brands that you are really inspired by, or kind of are there particular brands that you're looking at when you're seeking inspiration?
Yeah, I mean, there's a ton, and it's interesting you asked that because I find myself looking more to influencers and content creators as inspiration.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna say it's a mix, but in terms of a brand, I think Setwear Active has been a great brand to just like I mean I hardly follow brands on social like of my own free will. And they've been an amazing brand because they are just like creating content that their employees essentially just make themselves, which is awesome. So I'm like, oh my gosh, it's so cool to see like a behind the scenes of like how the employees of this brand work and function. But then creating content that's just like really funny and that feels like down to earth and content that like I actually want to watch. And then I'm like, oh man, like they get it.
Yeah.
I'm gonna go like shop, and because if they're getting it here on social and they're getting my attention, their product must be a reflection of that.
Yeah.
That's kind of like the psychology to me a little bit. It's like if I'm impressed by the content, if I'm feeling like the brand relates to me, you like kind of like have me you make the conversion where you're like, oh, I'm down the funnel now. It's over. I gotta
Yeah.
go to the website. I gotta check this out. So they've definitely been a brand that I felt inspired by because of that tactic.
What kind of content do you enjoy watching the most?
Oh, great question. I'm a gamer, in my free time, so if there's, like, a stream going on, I'm very into watching that. I'm also, like, trying to be more, educated in, like, the skincare space, so if there's, like, a product review, I'm in the product review, realm, and honestly, like, if you open my TikTok right now, it'll honestly be, like, product reviews, random memes, maybe they're animated or a little like abstract, and then probably just like celebrity gossip.
Yeah.
I love a good celebrity
Me
gossip
too. I
session.
love a
Yeah.
good celebrity gossip.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think what you said is important, that you look to influencers and creators for
Yep.
inspiration. And I think we're seeing a shift in the industry where brands are, becoming more like creators. Like they're looking at creators because yeah, like you said, people don't really want to follow brands. They want to follow, people
Yeah.
that they're interested in. And so like the brand literally going back to that humanization point, like, has to figure out a way to, like, develop content that humanizes them by usually showing, and I don't know if you agree, but, like, I love seeing, like, the founders and people,
Yeah.
like, building in public, and I want to see the team, and I want to, like, see the process of the product development or whatever it is, like, that the process and the behind the scenes is more important than the product itself, I think, in many cases.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because that has me thinking. I'm like, as you're talking, I'm like, oh, what does that like feeling listen? And I feel like it's like trust.
Yeah.
Right? Where it's like, oh, if you're seeing the founder, you're building an emotional connection with the founder. And all of a sudden I'm like, oh, well, I trust this person's opinion. So I trust the product they're making. I
Yeah.
trust like the team in charge of this and the team making it happen. And I think that's kind of like the unlock where like you humanize your brand, you gain trust, and you're like then authentically creating a like relationship with them on social. And it's like a lot of like how our own social lives work too, where it's like, oh, I trust you. I trust my friend for this product recommendation or this restaurant recommendation.
Yeah.
So I think that's a great point, and I totally agree with you.
Yeah, I think, what is her name? The Diary of a CEO marketing director. She was like, "Don't ever post product photos." Basically, like that should
Yeah,
be the least amount that you're posting. And that's something that we do at Posture too. We're like try to have direct product posts be the least and it really should be more about entertaining or educating and engaging, leading first and
yeah,
just trying to figure out how to create that like real raw content.
absolutely.
Um yeah, are there any other brands, I think it's kinda at the end,
Yeah,
that everyone should take a look at for inspiration?
this is like gonna be super niche. And it's like I'm like laughing just before I say it out loud, but KFC España
I love it.
is like I don't even know. I think it found me. So like it's real. Like when something gets on your For You page and you're like, "Oh my gosh," like follow, like comment, save. That's when it's like meant to be. But KFC España, I just remember it so vividly, like it's like meeting your love for the first time. It's so weird. But they showed up on my For You page and it was just like a meme. And I thought it was like a meme page that was just like obsessed with KFC. Which like I
I
can relate.
love
But
that.
when I clicked into it, I was like, this is so funny. And it was KFC España. Like, shout out to whoever you are out there creating that content. But it was like an instant follow because they were like funny and it's interesting. Not to like scrap everything we just said about like humanizing a brand, but like they didn't feature anyone on the page, but they were so into like the internet like humor of it all.
Yeah.
Like more of like it was more of like the if type of content where it's like, oh, this meme came from like this like obscure like Reddit thread and now it's like on TikTok and so they really leaned into that community. And so I guess it humanizes in a different way versus like putting someone in front of a camera. They're like, let's talk about things we know our community is already into. So which is awesome. But they are definitely a great follow because it's a less obvious kind of route to take when
Yeah.
it comes to a social strategy, but it's so great.
Well, I love that, and I know exactly, like, the type of brand content you're talking about. I think it humanizes the social team. Like, you are
Mhm.
now wondering who is running the account, and, like, this so even if they're not present, like, they don't you don't there's no photos, you don't know who they are, like, just that tone of voice, now you want to, like, know who is running the social.
Totally.
So, it's not necessarily the founding team or, like, the brand itself, but you're, like, connecting with whoever's posting
Yeah.
on social. And like that's a whole different level. And we're seeing that so much like with major brands like Beyond Meat on Threads is amazing. And
Yeah.
whoever like the social manager and I'm sure it's a big team, but like they embrace being that like intern persona that's like unhinged and that I feel like is working really well and for brands right now. Yeah, like the meme content or
Yeah.
like just joking or like being obviously really on the internet culture is that is a whole other approach to humanize a brand if you don't want to be on camera
Totally.
or have a budget
Right.
to hire creators or anything.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think like one thing I think about a lot is like how can we meet our audience where they are? And like your audience is likely online. Like if you're showing up on TikTok, your audience is like getting served all this crazy content. So it's like not that absurd if you take a little bit of that and ingest it into your own, right? You're not like
Yeah.
talking to your audience in a bubble. And also you're not talking like you aren't the audience of your content either is something I try to remind myself too, where it's like, oh, well, I don't get deep sea TikTok. I don't know why we should post about it. But like if our team's like, well, it's a huge trending conversation, we should lean into it. And it's one of those times where I'm like, oh well, I just because I don't know about it doesn't mean it won't resonate. I think those
Yeah.
are traps that it's like could be easy to fall into as a marketer where you're like, oh, I haven't seen this, like I'm not sure. But like trusting the team, trusting the kind of like insight they bring, it's like this is why it is also something that can help like humanize a brand if it feels a little more left field.
I'm curious in your career where you see yourself, 5, 10 years, and if you want to stay in social media or like what that future looks like for you.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's something I tell myself I should think about more often, but it's not something I find the time to. And I think, if you had asked me this question 5 years ago and I would have told you I want to work at a big brand and do social at a big brand. So pat myself on the back for that, where like I feel like I've accomplished like my former 5-year plan, which is great. And I feel so lucky for. But I think in terms of like the next 5 years, the next 10 years, I haven't quite figured it out yet. I think it's, social especially has changed so much. Working in social 5 years ago is so different from working in social now. It almost feels like a different career or a different job in
Absolutely.
some ways, which is good and bad, where I'm like, oh my gosh, like what's going to happen next with the industry? But I think, 5 or 10 years, I'd love to maybe continue working in the marketing slash creative space. I don't know to what capacity. I think if social continues to like expand the way it is, I would definitely love to be like a VP of social somewhere. Because I see so much more of that happening, and I see a lot more dialogue of like the next CMO is like your social media manager. And like that to me feels like really inspiring.
What do you mean by that?
There's been like a lot of dialogue, a lot of kind of articles around like Ad Week, the ad ages, where it's like your social media manager is poised to be your next CMO, and it's
Mhm.
because your social team's like in the trenches. They
Mhm.
like understand. There's like you could argue they understand your customer really well. They understand crisis comms. They understand full funnel like marketing approach, like influencer, customer service, community management. Like there aren't a lot of or not many marketing roles that can give you that kind of like myriad of experience in like one kind of function.
Yeah.
And so that's really interesting to see where, social media managers are gaining all this insight, gaining all this skill, like thinking quick on your feet, like public speaking, production. Um that in 10 years, like that's the experience that the CMOs are going to bring to the table. And I think that serves like a brand that's going to be fluent in whatever digital kind of age we live in. So that's sort of what I think about in 5 or 10 years, where it's like, if I do work in social, is that a future, that social media managers and social media marketers have? Like, is it
Yeah.
a CMO? Or there could be like a new thing that gets made up, and maybe we try a little bit of that. So, we'll see how it shakes out. But for now, I really think social is great, and I'd love to kind of stick around in the field to see where it goes in the next 5 years.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, that was a really great place to stop, and I'm excited to see where you go in the next 5 years.
Yeah, more
Thank
marketing
you.
soup.
Yeah, no marketing soup.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thank you all for having me. I can't wait to stay tuned to all the other episodes you guys have going on.